I think I'm going to make a start now. So thank you very much to everyone who has joined today. My name's Henry Phillipson. I'm Director of Marketing Communications at FairHQ. We're a venture capital firm based in London. We'll be hosting today's session alongside our friends at Thales. We're also part of the leadership team at ESGVC. For those of you who haven't dialed into any of our events previously, we're an initiative of about 125 VC firms across the UK and Europe who are helping portfolio companies to think about, understand, measure, improve their ESG performance. So we'll be organising sessions like this throughout the year on specific topics that we think are particularly important to startups driving their ESG performance. So today we'll be thinking about pay gap reporting with a particular focus on the gender pay gap. I'm going to leave it there. There's lots to discover in this discussion today. We've got some great speakers. I'll be handing over to kick things off to BB Group, part of the team at FairHQ, which is a specialist D&I reporting platform. So BB's going to help us think a little bit about the processes and policies that companies can put in place to start mitigating pay gaps early in their growth and as they scale. So BB, I think it's over to you. I'll leave you to it.
Thank you so much. Okay, let's make sure we have the screen. Can you all see my screen? Yeah. Oh, great. Okay, so hello, everyone. I'm really excited to join this webinar. And in this presentation, I'm going to share scientific evidence on how biases and heuristics show up at work. But more importantly, not only understanding the why, it's mostly about how you and your portfolio companies can go about minimizing the impact of these. So I'm going to focus specifically on the biases and heuristics and other structural issues that can contribute to the gender pay gaps that we still see in tech, but the research also is often applicable to ethnicity and on the other minority groups. So before we dive in, I'll quickly introduce myself. I'm BB, Head of Behavioral Science at FairHQ. Prior to that, I was Director of Research and Policy at Clue, and I used to also work at the Behavioral Insights team, which is also colloquially called the Nudge Unit, which spun out of UK government. And I have a PhD in behavioral science from University College London. So obviously fascinated by humans and love behavioral science, and that's what I'll bring in this webinar. And I'll go through quite a lot of topics. I will try to go not too quickly, but I just wanted to ask you, if you have any questions or comments, please write them in the chat, and then we can cover them towards the end. So this is our agenda for today. First, very briefly, some key diversity inclusion foundations, just so we're all talking about the same thing. I want to cover some common issues and biases, and throughout, we're going to talk about 13 behavioral design tips that you and portfolio companies can use to mitigate, to make sure that bias just doesn't have a chance of showing up and creating these gaps in the first place. So we actually aren't a workshop company at all. We are a tech startup. And what our day job looks like, just wanted to give you a super brief overview. And spoiler alert is that it's all about diversity, inclusion, and behavior change. So FairHQ, we're an early stage startup, venture backed. FairHQ takes care of the diversity inclusion process end to end. And there's three parts to it. First, we help companies understand their diversity inclusion. So data layer and recommendation engine to understand how you're set up from the perspective of processes, policies, representation, and behaviors. Then it's mostly about embedding the change and reducing bias, about businesses with evidence-based recommendations and implementation guides and nudges. And then the third element, which is really critical too, is to measure progress and impact over time to help companies not drop the ball and keep making progress. And we are currently in private beta, and these are some of our amazing early customers, and they include some VC funds as well. So that was a really, really brief tour. Now let's talk about diversity inclusion. So obviously it's not a new topic. Companies, especially in the Western world, have been investing lots of time and money in diversity inclusion for years. And so the question is, why have we made so little progress, especially in tech? And some of the answer can be found in this number of $8 billion per year that has been going mostly towards superficial training, like unconscious bias training. And the question is, does it work? So the idea of these trainings is that if we're more aware of our biases and heuristics and stereotypes and all of those kind of things, we would be able to course correct both our minds and our actions, which actually turns out to be really hard to do. So data shows that most people actually default back to their pre-training mindset in less than 24 hours after those trainings. And very robust impact evaluations show that the levels of diversity in companies that took this training don't improve over time, and in some cases actually even backfires, reducing the representation of women and people of color at senior levels. So we think we can do much better than that, and we should, for the sake of our employees and for the success of our companies. So then if it's not unconscious bias training, where should we start? When you think about diversity, inclusion, and equality, we think it's useful to think of it as a pyramid. So to attract and retain diverse talent that are able to contribute fully, it's important to start by creating equitable foundations. And these equitable foundations are the processes and policies that you embed in your business, and that really, about the day-to-day experience, but it's about hiring, onboarding, performance, pay, bonus, complaints, employee exit. These are all really important to look at from a diversity inclusion perspective. And really we look at here, how do biases unwittingly exclude people without you even realizing it, or how can they lead to suboptimal decisions? And really what our philosophy here is, let's not try to focus on debiasing our minds, because that's extremely hard and also requires lots of training and motivation. We can actually improve the daily processes and policies that we use to make decisions like who to hire, who to promote, or who to give a stretch assignment to. So by embedding these strong foundations first, it will be much easier for all managers, leaders, and employees to be much more inclusive in their day-to-day, and ultimately you'll be in a much better position to take maximum advantage of the diverse perspectives on your team, and you will be more attractive also to diverse candidates. So I'm going to talk about the first tip. Now we're going to go through lots of different topics here, from hiring first. This might not be a surprise to you, because I think a lot of companies have already started thinking about this, but the language in job ads does send very strong signals to potential job candidates. And really it sends a signal of, will I fit in here? And the research shows that masculine coded language like driven, champion, and fearless can put women off from applying to jobs. And that is true, especially in male dominated fields like the tech sector. So using gender neutral or feminine coded words, as well as those masculine coded words, can actually help you attract more women to apply. And I should mention that the reverse is also true. So if you're looking to attract men to female dominated roles like marketing or customer service, also try to avoid uniquely feminine coded words like support, understand, and dependable. So to bring this a bit more to life, I'm going to show you a case study with Tie to Every, which is a tech startup based in the Nordics. They ran an experiment where they created two versions of a job ad for a front-end engineering role. One with their business as usual language, and one where they changed the language. So really two identical, just changing some of these coded, masculine coded words. So here are some of the words they switched. From competent, they changed it to knowledgeable, driven to focused, and independent to self-starter. Now, you might think that's a really, really small change, doesn't cost anything at all, but let's take a look at how much they managed to increase the percentage of women applying from 14% of female applicants to 36%. Now, that's still not 50% women applying, but that's a huge increase for just one job ad. So my key recommendation here is that you should always check your job description for gender-coded language. Ideally, you use as many neutral words as possible, or at least a mix of masculine and feminine coded words. And the reason that I mentioned these neutral words is that there's a very large study by Appcast with around 11,000 jobs. And they found that in tech, job ads with both male and female coded words got 44% more applications than those using only male coded words. So you're not only attracting more women to your roles, you're also attracting more candidates overall. And there are actually free tools out there, which I can send after this webinar. We have some resources to share. There's also excellent resources like Textio and Applied. You can put your job description in there and they will give you the feedback. Now, we've just looked at how subtle implicit gender coding can impact applicant behavior, but there's more. The way that you signal flexible working options also has a surprisingly large effect on who applies. And advertising flexible working options can attract candidates who might otherwise be excluded from opportunities. And of course, a large part of this group would be people with caring responsibilities. And another reason why I included this study in this webinar is that it's really exciting that real companies have started doing experiments in the real world, like Zurich Insurance in the UK. So they tested how many women applied. And again, they have two different versions of a job description, standard job description versus a job description with a few clear signals of flexible working options. And this is the adapted job description that you see. So first, you see a clear signpost in the job title heading part-time, job share, full-time. Then second, you see just below it a clear mention of flexible working options at the top job description. And then there is an inclusive sentence at the bottom, which says this role is available part-time because we want the best people for our roles. And we recognize that sometimes those people aren't available full-time. So again, let's take a look at the results, right? So significantly more women applied to the open vacancies. Overall, they saw a 16.4% increase. And keep in mind that this was done with 400 open roles. This is not just for one open position, like open roles across all levels of the organization. So overall, 60.4% increase just by making it clear that working arrangements are flexible. And more interestingly, actually, is for senior positions, that increase jumped to 19.3%. And after this was an experiment run over an entire year, the number of women hired by Zurich Insurance rose by 33%. I should also mention, though, the important on a side note is that gender gaps will only narrow if both men and women take advantage of flexible working options. So one of the biggest contributors to promotion and pay gaps is the unequal distribution of caretaking responsibilities. So to really fight against that, companies should make flexible work a viable option for everyone so that it becomes the norm instead of the exception. And that's really important for signaling men that they should and can take advantage of these options as well. So as a recommendation, we would say make all jobs flexible by default to remove the friction for hiring managers, make it easy, and make sure that you're also signaling it clearly in your job descriptions. Now your job ad is live, but how do you select a great shortlist? Of course, we go to the next challenge. So if you're committed to achieving diversity goals, you need to be mindful of the proportional representation of minority groups in your final shortlist. And research shows time and time again that having just one person from an underrepresented group on the list really won't cut it. And I'll show you the evidence now. So again, mental shortcuts play us tricks. What your finalist pool looks like sends signals to hiring managers in charge of making the hire. So if it's 75% plus white and male, that sends a really strong signal implicitly that they're the norm. And that is then the status quo. And hiring, of course, is a risky business. A wrong hire is very costly to any business, but especially early stage companies. So it will feel like a less risky decision to choose a candidate that already fits the norm. And indeed, when researchers looked at lots and lots of hiring decisions over a couple of years, they found that the probability of hiring a woman or a person of color when there are only one in a pool of 4 was statistically close to 0. Not the 25% that you might logically expect if they are 1 out of 4. When 2 women made it on a shortlist of 4, the chance of hiring a woman jumped up to 50%, which is what you would expect. So when we look at the research on this phenomenon and also the research on critical mass, research tells us that we're more likely to create a new status quo when there's at least 30% minority representation on the shortlist. So our recommendation is to make this an expectation with your hiring managers and also external recruiters. And it might mean that you need to keep open the role for longer and post in a wider variety of channels, but really is very powerful. Now let's tackle noise and halo effect. I'm curious to hear if you've already come across these. And this is actually one of the most rigorous findings of the last few years, which is that the methods we traditionally use to evaluate a candidate's potential are very, very noisy. So as soon as you meet a candidate face-to-face in your interview process, our brains start making snap judgments. And these, unfortunately, often lower people's chance of success if they don't look the part. So if you're hiring a senior backend engineer into an all-male team, a woman candidate might seem out of place to the hiring manager. And you might also end up hiring someone because they would be a great person to have a Friday beer with, or because they have similar hobbies to you. So there's loads of implicit biases that come into play when it comes to interviews. So, and you can see in this graph here that, again, a very large meta-analysis of lots of different methods that people use to assess candidate potential. The methods that actually are good predictors of job performance are work sample tests. And you'll see that unstructured interviews, years of education, job years of experience are pretty terrible predictors of on-the-job performance. So work samples really are very important. And we recommend using work samples early on in the process, as early as possible. And this way you'll get a really clear idea of their ability right off the bat, and your judgment of their performance will be more untainted by bias. So I'll give you an example from our own FairHQ experience. We've been growing quite a lot in the last few months. And last summer, we actually hired for an internship role, summer internship, and we received 900 applications. So to be considered, candidates had to complete 3 short work sample tasks that really gave them a realistic taste of what the role required and gave us a really good sense of their fit for the role. So these were just 2 of the examples of the work sample. So they completed these, and only after they completed these short work samples, we invited them for the first interview. So once it was time for us to evaluate the candidates' responses, first of all, we received 900 applications to our LinkedIn ad, but around 90 actually completed the entire work sample task. That's a really great first sifting mechanism to make sure that only the most motivated people apply. But then once we had to review these 90 applications, it's really important to be mindful of the halo effect, which is an effect where someone's really great or poor early answers end up influencing their later answers unduly. So instead of focusing on one candidate for too long, which happens when you look at their answer to question 1, question 2, question 3, and so forth, instead, we put all of their answers into a big spreadsheet and rated all candidates' responses to each question in turn. So candidate A to question 1, then candidate B, then candidate C. So going question by question instead. And that's again, doesn't cost anything, but it's really powerful, and it helps you make sure that you're as unbiased, uninfluenced by these little pieces of noise that you want to avoid. And then let's finally talk about salary as well, right? Because we're talking about pay gaps here. And there's the issue of anchoring bias, which is really interesting. And again, lots of robust research. This is one stat that I put on the slide. In UK tech, 61% of the time, men are offered higher salaries than women for the same role at the same company. And another stat that just jumped out at me was that the overall gender wage gap in UK tech is 4%, according to higher data. But many UK startups report much higher wage gaps between 10 and 20%. And some of that might have to do with seniority of roles, but definitely not all, because the data and the research actually points to a very clear culprit, which is expectations. Women are generally, from the research we see this, being offered less because they ask for less. And once we account for candidates asking salary, the wage gap essentially disappears. And this is based on research from UC Berkeley's Opportunity Lab. And this gap is actually even bigger for more senior roles of people who have 15 years or more of experience. So how can you then make sure that people who join your business get fair and similar starting salaries? Well, there's a few really important recommendations here. First, never ask about previous salary or salary expectations, because you're introducing variations between gender that actually don't have to do anything with their skill or role. And you should always thereby give your offer first based on what you pay others in similar roles. Make sure it's benchmarked and fairly placed in your salary bands. Because, and this is where anchoring bias comes in, if you ask for salary expectations first, their response may anchor your offer. So either driving it up or down. And relying on their estimate of a fair salary, you would be ending up paying different salaries to different people, which of course isn't really fair. Being a great fit for the role should determine their salary, not how well they negotiate. So, if you look at all of the hiring recommendations, this one is the most clearly linked to avoiding gender pay gaps from developing. Now, also I wanted to cover very briefly the performance review, because obviously the way that people receive feedback and the way they are encouraged to develop does have a really clear impact on how they progress throughout the company. About 95% of companies use performance appraisals in one form or another. But unfortunately, most of the time they do them in a way that bias can creep in. And I'll show you some of the evidence. So researchers reviewed just over 200 performance reviews in a tech company to understand what type of feedback people receive and in gender plays a role. And this is, of course, really detailed textual data that they analyze using machine learning. And they found a few really interesting things. First, this piece of feedback: teams really like you, keep doing what you're doing. This is fake sounding praise. 57% of women got this type of praise compared to only 43% of men. And of course, the problem with vague feedback is that it isn't going to help anyone move up the career ladder. It doesn't identify things you're great at. It also doesn't identify things you could be working on over time. And from this research also, we see very interesting general patterns that women and men get encouraged to focus on different topics in their feedback. Generally, we see that women tend to get encouraged to focus on delivery, coping with politics, getting along, and being more confident, while men are encouraged to set the vision, leverage politics, claim their space, and display more confidence. So you can see how these different types of feedback actually creates like different paths, right, for people to focus on delivery versus vision. And of course, you create more leadership capability when you encourage people to focus on vision and not just on delivery. And then there's a second piece of feedback that is actually a great piece of feedback. You resolved the divide or the crisis between the engineering and the product team. Thanks to that, we did manage to ship the product on time. Great piece of feedback. It's feedback tied to business outcomes. And in the research, again, 60% of the men had their feedback tied to business outcomes, while only 40% of women did. So the key takeaways are that good feedback is developmentally supported and it's specific. So one, again, no cost nudge that you can implement is to tell managers that their feedback will be reviewed. This accountability nudge has helped companies make sure all feedback is as objective and fair as possible. And it's all based on cognitive research that when you know that you're going to have to justify your decisions and the way you've described something, you're going to be more objective and fair. And also another small tip would be to set minimum and maximum word count for feedback. It's just a very small help for people to make sure that they write similar level of detail for all of their direct reports. And then another one that, this might be a new topic for you. The research has been growing over the last few years on this topic. We call it office housework, and I'll explain what it means. So in your own team, is it always the same people who offer to help out? And do some people get asked to help out more often? Research shows that women face different sets of pressures and accepted behaviors at work. And especially women can face backlash when they say no to a task that is not central to their role, while men don't face this backlash quite as often. So as a result, as fear of backlash, but also as implicit social norms in companies, women tend to bear the brunt of this office housework, slowing potentially their career progress because they have less time for visible, prestigious, glamorous stretch tasks. And you can, and these are some of the examples that you see on the screen of typical office housework tasks. They're really important for your team culture, very important for smooth running of a team. But ideally, you make sure that everyone helps out with these kind of tasks and you rotate responsibility. So that's one thing, definitely rotate these kind of tasks between the different members of your team. But also you should celebrate and recognize people for their contribution to team supportive tasks. You can make it a part of your performance evaluations and make sure that you for example, give feedback at the end of the year or in your performance review cycle on how they contribute to the team. And then when we think about pay gaps from developing, of course, promotions gap are a big contributor as well. There is a wealth of research that in our Western society, female leaders still continue to face bias compared to male leaders. And that's because men are still more readily associated with prototypical leadership qualities like assertiveness than women. And that still has an impact on who gets promoted and who doesn't. So instead of focusing very much about the underlying biases, I want to talk about how you can avoid these. And it's based on excellent research by Iris Bonet, who's a Harvard professor, who is really, the queen of this field of research. And they did an experiment where they look at comparative decision making, where you ask people to look at 2 candidates at the same time, rather than reviewing just 1 candidate at a time. So this helps managers to make promotion decisions only based on merit and not based on biased evaluations of future performance. So imagine that a manager has 4 direct reports, and they're asked to decide if they want to put up someone for promotion. What typically might happen is that a manager looks at all of their direct reports and thinks who would be the best candidate for this role, thinking about their, how they would show up in the future. What would be much better is to gather information about each direct report, explicitly compare them against each other, and that will help them to focus objectively on their past performance. And they've put them in a comparative mindset, which is much less easily swayed by bias. So another small tip, which isn't on the screen, but it's quite powerful, is to prepare a list of potential employees up for promotion. And if you can, recommend at least 2 individuals from your team, and not just focus on the 1 person that comes to mind most easily. Instead, spend a little bit more time, 5-10 minutes extra, to encourage you to think beyond the obvious top candidate. And once this list then has prepared and all managers have contributed, you should meet to discuss the suggested candidates comparatively, side by side, using their recent performance reviews and progression criteria to guide you. And again, a small tip, but you will focus on their objective performance and promote the candidate who's best fit for the job, not based on some vague assumptions about future potential. And now it's finally time to talk about pay, and also our last tip for this session. When it comes to pay gaps, we should look at how pay decisions are made and justified. And bias takes hold whenever our decisions are left to individuals. Obviously, not all the time, but we're looking at general patterns here. And researchers found that when decision makers have to justify their decision, then gender actually ceases to be an important part determining rates of pay. People make better decisions when they know they will have to justify them. And I mentioned it earlier when it came to performance reviews too. But this applies to pay. So having a task force, committee, or a team who reviews pay decisions does add that extra layer of accountability. And this committee ideally should also be as diverse as possible. So you will cover all potential blind spot and review decisions from a range of perspectives. So really our tips here would be to track this proportionality, review regularly, and especially do this get together following pay reviews and promotion cycles to check the fairness of outcomes. So look at the proportionality of the pay and bonus decisions, and look at, for example, the rate at which women versus men got a promotion or pay improvement, pay increase, and also for white versus people of color employees. These are small calculations you can do just to keep an eye on these things, and quite powerful, give you interesting data, and then you will have a really good sense of where to improve, where to work on, and how to embed these ideas into your next pay cycle. So I know this was a whistle-stop tour. We've talked about job ads, putting together short lists, evaluating candidates, and reviewing employee performance, assigning team tasks, leadership potential, and selecting for promotions and pay. And in each case, there is this low-cost and tangible action you can take to avoid bias from taking hold. And some of these recommendations might be completely common sense to you, but what we find is that they aren't commonly implemented, and that's really the issue. So think about your own team. Where do you see the biggest gaps? Which of these tips are you most keen to implement? I would love to hear it. But first, I will just conclude my presentation, and then I will hand back to Serena. So let's leave behind the idea that we can fix the problem by changing our mindset. Instead, we need to focus on changing our organizations. And this we need to do with good design, good behavioral design. So it will help us make sure we focus on the factors that really matter, and let's not get ourselves distracted by noise. These aren't expensive solutions, but you do need to adapt the way you currently do things. And that's all about smart design. And one final note, I know you might be interested in helping your young portfolio companies to make some of these changes. That's an excellent time to start thinking about these things, because when companies are small, you still have the ability to set really the tone for what you want to be as a company. Being intentional about it from the get-go is really powerful. So that's it. If you're interested in learning more about our private data, about our platform, reach out. We're always very, very happy to talk. And I will also send over some handout after with some of the research we've covered in case you want to learn more. Thank you so much. I will hand over back to Serene.
Thank you very much, Bibi. That was really insightful and lots of really good content there. If you do have any questions, please do put them in the chat box and we're going to get to them shortly. And now we're going to jump into our Q&A segment of the presentation. So it's great to welcome Bob and Lena to the panel. They will be joining us. So Bob at McCrate Butcher is a partner at the London law firm Marriott Harrison. Bob heads the employment division and focuses on advising major clients on all aspects of UK employment law. Lena Taylor is the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at GoCardless, the global payments provider. Prior to her work at GoCardless, Lena was a people and culture consultant and spent 9 years at Innocent, where she was the European head of people. So thank you both for joining us. Bob, I'm going to come to you first. We've seen that there's regulation come in to make gender pay gap reporting mandatory if you're a company of more than 250 people. Could you share a little bit about what the regulation says and how companies should implement this? I think, Bob, you'll just need to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Apologies. We've had legislation since 2017, which is the gender pay gap reporting regulations. Fundamentally, as you say, they apply to employing entities which employ 250 or more at snapshot date, which is 5th of April. And effectively, the regs require employers to provide, if you like, core data about their gender pay gap. Which is data around effectively the pay gap differential worked out on the basis of differences in hourly pay, and also data around the gender bonus gap and numbers of employees in different quartiles in relation to in relation to pay as well. So we've had that legislation from 2017. It applies at the moment to larger employers. There's a sort of general criticism about the legislation that it doesn't really have a huge amount of teeth. Basically, the legislation requires employers to publish data and to publish it within 12 months of the April snapshot date. But there isn't really any teeth to the legislation insofar as employers don't do that, other than possibly a hope, if you will, I suppose, that candidates might start to review the gender pay gap reports and those stats when considering, whether or not to apply for particular roles. But yeah, we have that legislation at the moment. It applies to companies employing 250 or more.
Thanks, Bob. That's really helpful to know. I know we have a lot of early stage companies on the call today. Bibi, if I could ask you, what stage do you think that companies should be thinking about collecting gender pay gap reporting? Should they wait until they're 250 people, or is there something that they can do before that?
Great question. So actually, we work with startups. We have some very small startups we work with, but most of them from around 25 to 400-ish employees. And actually, most of the companies start being interested in collecting this data and comparing their pay gaps from, I would say, already 50, 60 employees, especially those that are growing quickly. They tend to be interested. And you can, I think one of the companies that just comes to mind now, they were about 30 employees and they were collecting their pay gaps and we were helping them calculate it. So I definitely would encourage you to start looking into this before 250, because when you're small, you're still setting up your process and policies. It's much easier to correct some of these gaps than if you're already a large organization.
That makes sense. And Lena, given your role at GoCardless, how does gender pay gaps fit into your wider agenda of promoting D&I?
Yeah, so I think we look at it as part of the whole diversity inclusion agenda. So we are actually now coming up to 800 people. So we absolutely have to report on the gender pay gap, but we are also committing to a broader D&I agenda, hence my role, which is a relatively new role. And I think that's been a bit of a trend in the last year or two, right? So we want to look at much more than gender. So that means we have gone through a process of collecting data and having more. But as Bibi was saying through her presentation, gender, there's just so much more data and so much more information out there. So it does inform lots of other things we do. So when we looked at our gender pay gap, for example, it informed how we might think about our ethnicity pay gap, should we go there, and other aspects of our D&I strategy.
That makes sense. And Lena, how was the process of going through that gender pay gap reporting process? How did you communicate to employees and the like?
Yeah, so I think there's one of two ways of doing it. In previous organizations, when I was at Innocent Drinks, we had a team who could support the sort of the data crunching, if you like, internally. At Go Cardless, I've only been there for 5 months, but we did the reporting in October for 2 years worth, and we used an external company who do this. So we used Towers Willis Watson, and that just meant that the crunching of the data was done by some experts who could also give us a quick insight into how they look at that data based on other organizations. That was a really practical way of them focusing on what does the data tell us. And I think the most important thing for us in terms of our culture and values is communicating really transparently of where we are, what the results say, what do they mean, and then obviously what do we intend to do about that. So I think to the point that was being made earlier by Bob, it is quite a blunt reporting tool, the gender pay gap, but it's forced organizations to look at it and then have a conversation about it. I think focus on the conversation in particular.
And just,
no, that makes sense.
Sorry, just picking up on that. I mean, so one of the voluntary things that organizations can do is provide a narrative in relation to that data. So insofar as the data reveals things, they can indicate that it reveals things. We've noticed this, and this is our action plan as to how we're going to address some of those issues. So if you like, one of the most, I suppose, active uses that an organization can make is to, if you like, draw from the data, what are the lessons we're learning and what is our action plan? And then obviously each year reviewing the progress of that action plan and indeed the action plan itself.
That makes sense. And Bibi, thinking about some of the content that was in your presentation, you know, we've talked about how gender is only one lens of a very multitude of lenses that we can use to look at bias. What one priority would you give to an early stage founder in helping them to prevent pay disparity in their organization?
Yes. Well, of course, hiring is one of the areas that most founders start looking at when it comes to diversity and inclusion. Mm-hmm. When you think about hiring, I'm a really big fan of avoiding CVs as much as you can. So avoid looking at CVs because there's so much noise in there that actually is not predictive of job performance at all. So where you can, add in a really small work sample. And I've already seen in the comments, it is really important that you don't make it an onerous 3-hour task, right? Because you also can't make the barriers too high for people who are, who have limited time available. So work sample is one. And when you're actually negotiating salaries, a really small but important thing to do is just add your salary range to the job description and never ask for salary expectations. Never asking for salary expectations will do a huge job of avoiding gender pay gaps from forming, but any types of pay gaps from forming.
Okay, brilliant. And I'm going to start going into the chat box. So please do put your questions in there if you do have any. I think a question that's being asked is the best way to tackle privacy concerns when you're doing gender pay gap reporting. You know, how do you communicate to keep that trust and transparency there? Does anyone have a particular thought on this, Bibi or Lena specifically?
I'll go if you like. So we went through a process of wanting to collect data. So I guess one of the first things was being really clear on what we can legally collect and how we should store it, et cetera, and for the different countries we operate in or have offices in. So that's the first thing, make sure you're doing it in the right way, and then having a tool to do it so it can remain anonymous, etc. But absolutely, the biggest thing was having a really clear, actually a policy in the end, which is on our intranet, to say, we're collecting this kind of data, this is what we're going to do with it, and this is how we're handling it. And we've had to keep reassuring people. We are going to try and be transparent as possible with the insights from that. So what you put in, you get out, so that people can see we're using it in the right way. But I can already see from when I look at the data, certain things people are happy to reveal. And then typically, you know, if you look at the sexual orientation category within, you know, let's say London statistics, it already is, you know, considered a very low representation because people don't want to reveal things like that. So it's how can you build that level of comfort, security, privacy within a business through your communications, through what you then do with it, and then show tangible action. Because if people start seeing, oh, I'm from a minority, that data has informed a certain action, they're potentially more likely to start filling it in. But don't expect to get 100% voluntary data collection. And we've kept it voluntary. We've managed to get to 70% now, which has taken a little bit of work in the last 6 months. But we're hoping to encourage that to grow as well.
That's great. And Bibi, how are you thinking about remote work and part-time work at organizations that are scaling really quickly? We have a question from Victoria Ferguson, who asks, how do you encourage startups to offer part-time work at a time when they're being encouraged to grow very, very quickly? Do you have any feedback on that, or anything you've seen from the work that you've done?
Yeah, that's a good and challenging question. So, you know, the presentation that focuses really just on the available evidence, which, you know, the evidence that I was showing was Zurich Insurance, which is a very established company, right? Doesn't have anything to do with rapidly scaling startups. So, you know, I would definitely put my not question marks, but I would definitely always go with the experimentation approach rather than just applying it and hoping that it will work. Obviously, when you are rapidly scaling, it can be difficult to accommodate for lots of different flexible working options, or at least flexible working. I think at any company now, you know, after COVID, any company is really mindful of flexible working. Part-time working and job sharing can be a little bit more burdensome. But you know, it depends on whether or not it's your goal, right? If you have diversity inclusion goals where you want to encourage, for example, your women to be able to get promoted to higher levels of the organization, and you know that some women need to go to part-time roles because, you know, they're sharing caring responsibilities, it might be really important for you to consider. Some of the startups we work with, they just don't do part-time work. They only offer full-time roles. I think I would just, you know, my feedback would just be really explicit and mindful about it. So consider it. If you're not doing it, be clear about it. If you are open to offering flexible working, but especially part-time options, just also be really clear about it. I think that would be my approach. And then implement it, pilot it, see how it goes, and then adapt from there.
And all I would just say from a legal perspective, just on the basis of that, is, so obviously hybrid working going forward is massively interesting. What's happened in relation to obviously lockdown working and working from home is huge numbers of people have been able to demonstrate they can carry out their role working remotely in a more flexible way. Now, from a legal perspective, there's always been a right to make a flexible working request. It's always been there. It's been amended, so it's a wider right than it was a few years ago. The real risk, legal risk from the point of view of employers, if they don't properly consider requests for flexible working, is an indirect sex discrimination claim. And basically, because of lockdown working, it will be harder for employers to turn down requests for flexible working without real risk of indirect sex discrimination claims. The reason for that being that it will be far more straightforward for employees to say, sorry, you're trying to turn it down. The reason you're turning it down doesn't stack up. I've demonstrated I can do my role working on a hybrid basis, and therefore you cannot objectively justify requiring me to work full time or requiring me to return to the office, whatever it might be. And therefore, what we will see going forward absolutely will be more flexible working requests where employers try and, if you like, get people back to full-time working in the office, and there will be a real risk of legal liability for employers in turning down those requests against this background where it's much easier for people to say, I've demonstrated I can carry out my role in this way.
That's a really interesting insight, Bob. Thanks. And Lena, just thinking about, scaling, you saying that you're going to close to 800 people. What has been the biggest challenge in terms of collecting the data and actioning it, and kind of keeping up with the rate of change in terms of headcount?
Good point. I think in some ways the surge of new people has meant that we can pitch it at the onboarding stages as why we're doing the data collection. And actually, if you look at the data, people who are filling it in are the ones in the 0 to 6 month category. So they're all completing it. Actually, the people who've been here longer, who you have to, direct to a system and get them to fill it in is the big thing. I think in terms of other challenges with collecting the data, it's then what can you do with that? So making sure you're collecting things for the right reason, making sure it stays relevant as well, because a term becomes out of date straight away and somebody will pick it up and wonder why you're asking for a certain category to be filled in. So, I was just reviewing it this week because we have the data from people applying for roles as well as internal people. And quite quickly you realize that, we're collecting what is your religious belief and what are we going to do with that? What does it really tell you? It's not really relevant anymore, is it? Focus on the ones that you do really need to collect and that you can take action from. So I think it's making sure that you're using the data to tell an insight and a story and then linking it to an action is the biggest thing. And then being able to track progress, because often you're having to collect the data in a really anonymized way, obviously, but then you want to show those progress measures and do it in pockets and areas which, you have to keep it at a high level to enable it to be anonymous, but you want it to be meaningful. So it's balancing those two things as well.
Okay, great. And we're just going to go to Bibi for one of the last questions. I think you mentioned in your presentation about unconscious bias and how it was a superficial training. What kind of training, if any, would you encourage teams to do to make sure that there is a culture of, equality and inclusion in the organization?
Yes. Okay, excellent. So I definitely am not. I'm definitely not saying that all unconscious bias training is terrible, but there are some ways that you can improve them. So one of the things, when they look at all the different types of trainings that people get in companies, the things that make them less worthwhile are online trainings and limited time training. So for example, a 1 hour D&I training a year is definitely not going to move people's minds or hearts. So if you want to embed training that really is going to make a difference, it needs to be ideally interactive. So things like role playing, acting out different scenarios, learning about different people's perspectives is really important. More time. So we see that, for example, more than 5 hours of training is starting to see a positive effect. And some of the latest research also shows that perspective taking training is really powerful. So that's a lot less about understanding how we're unconsciously biased, because our conscious biases are really, really hard to change. They are unconscious. It's really hard to get them to a conscious level. But actually, perspective taking is a skill that you can learn, and that's much more effective.
Okay, that makes sense. And then thinking about equal pay, particularly in the startup landscape when many employees are offered equity. How do you balance that out when some employees are wanting increased equity and some of them are wanting higher percentage of pay, and is there any recommendation for companies currently going through this?
Yeah, so I've prepared a little handout which I will share with you, Serena, after, and then you can share it. So there's one company that recently did this, Lollipop. They're a UK-based grocery startup, and they've done this brilliantly. So, my real recommendation would be to make it really clear, transparent, and structured, whatever salary band you decide to offer. And what they did is they have this little calculator that job applicants can go into, and they can trade off salary for equity. And anyone can go through that trade-off. Anyone knows where they're at in the bands, and they can make that personal decision, right? But the key here is that it's transparent and it applies the same for absolutely everyone.
Makes a lot of sense, and we'll definitely be sharing that after today's event. Bob, I've got a question for you. Someone asked, what's the usual process when you're offered a role, you've signed the contract, but then you've encountered that the employer intending to hire has been problematic on social media. Can you rescind the offer? And is there, when there might be a reputational risk in hiring them?
Sorry, can the employer rescind the offer when they've? So I mean, it will depend on the offer. I mean, is the offer made subject to acceptable references, for example, and or so most financial institutions will be made subject to background checks and appropriate references. And obviously, if you discover during that process, it may be that you're indicating the condition for the contract to come into place hasn't been met. But basically, you'll need to look carefully at the offer. Is it, has it been accepted? Was it a conditional offer or not? If it's not a conditional offer and you're seeking to rescind, well, the individual may be entitled to notice. And obviously, you've got to be a bit careful about anything on social media, because is it accurate? Is the comment discriminatory in some shape or form, etc., etc. So certainly, you'd need to investigate quite carefully, before as an employer you're taking that action.
Okay, great. We've got a question from Dylan, who asks, is there a minimum amount of employees required to make a useful gender pay gap report? Could it be harmful or misleading when started too early? So that really applies to really early stage startups. So I wondered if Phoebe, you had any thoughts on that?
Yes, yeah. So I won't talk from a legal perspective here, but yeah, it's definitely important to look at the numbers that go into your calculations. Very small samples will skew stronger, right? And we're looking at median. So if you're looking at pay gaps, you're looking at median pay. So that has less of a risk of massive outliers. But still, I would say I'm not going to really give you a minimum number because I don't have anything in mind. But anything less than 5 employees per group, we never display, for example, at FairHQ. So if you have less than 5 women and 5 men in your company, then I would avoid it, because then you're getting too much into, very, very easily de-anonymize the data. But more than that, so that would be probably less than 10 or less than 5 women, 5 men. But maybe Bob or Lena has a more personal example of how they've experienced this.
I mean, all I would say is I think often when employers produce gender pay reports, there are anomalies that come through. There are various different ways in which anomalies can come through. For example, it may be that an employer has made a real push in relation to new entrants and trying to recruit more women, and perversely enough, it actually increases the gender pay gap rather than reduces it, because you get new entrants into the workforce who are lower paid. So there can be anomalies. And if you like, the challenge and or opportunity, depending whichever way you look at it, is to try and identify those and explain them in the narrative, where you explain the data, obviously to your current employees and potential job applicants, and obviously the action plan as a result. Similarly, I think there are many examples where changes in the senior leadership team can skew data very quickly, one way or another. So I think, yes, anomalies do come up. Another one, for example, I think salary sacrifice isn't included in the gender pay gap reporting, for example, and predominantly more women take advantage of salary sacrifice opportunities. All of those sorts of things. So very much once one has done the data, it's almost looking at what it says, identifying those anomalies and explaining them, and then tying into your action plan.
That's very helpful. And then maybe thinking a little bit about some of the processes that can help really boost that gender pay gap, and particularly thinking about women in senior leadership people or people of color in senior leadership positions. What would be your recommendation to foster that landscape when that can be achieved?
Okay, so fostering more diversity at leadership levels. Yes, this is one of the key challenges that a lot of the startups we work with encounter. Obviously, we all know the data, we know the landscape. I would say that this is not a tick box exercise to increase diversity at leadership levels. You need to think a little bit more long term, and you can't expect massive change very quickly, within a year. It's not reasonable. Also, leadership levels tend to not change very much, right? So takes more time. But there are some very interesting frameworks, and we have a blog post on one, which I can also send over, which is the gender proportionality framework, where you look at every level of your organization, you look at the representation of different genders, and you set goals for, in the next 2 years, I want my top level to represent the level below it. And you will go down the organization like that. And over time, you'll be able to achieve those goals. But that's like a 6-year project to get to perfect hitting those goals. Internal progression is really important too, to think about how you develop leadership potential internally. And obviously, when you're hiring senior leadership roles, you will want to make sure that you tap into a very broad network. So you don't only go to, if you're founded from a very typical background, you might not be tapping into all of the other backgrounds or other networks. So it's really important to ask, for example, minority team members to also share the job description, to talk to diverse people in your network, to look at your LinkedIn and say, how can I make that more diverse? All of these things really do help. So it's not a one thing that will make a difference. It's like looking at all these small actions, embedding them, and tracking the progress over time.
That's really helpful, Bibi. And Lena, do you have any kind of follow-up on that experience, or can share any challenges on what it takes to hire diverse senior leadership positions?
Yeah, to Bibi's point, it takes time. You need to think of it as a long-term plan. I think one of the things, probably in response to maybe the last 2 questions, is for small companies, it's one of the first things you could do is just start putting a data lens of, let's say, gender on everything. I think that's the one thing that's even missing in big organizations. If you think about what the gender pay gap is, it's actually about talent distribution. So don't bother trying to work out the gender pay gap, because it's a complicated tool. It's a snapshot. It has lots of problems with it. And when you're less than 50 people, you probably haven't got time to do it. Instead, look at your talent distribution, have a data set of how many men and women have you got at each level and within each team, and look at that as you grow constantly. The more people are looking at that data, the more they're going to start talking and thinking about it. And what does gender pay gap do? It tells you that you haven't got a balanced distribution of women, or women are all at the bottom and not enough at the top. And the more you can start seeing that shift, the more you'll see the changes. And it's the same for ethnicity, right? I don't need to do an ethnicity pay gap report to know that we haven't got enough diversity at the top, so that there will be a big ethnicity pay gap. I could tell you that straight away. So how can you just start looking at the data to do with any lens of diversity, and start with gender and age, because you have to collect that and look at what it's telling you, and keep looking at it in everything. Promotion, progression, performance reviews, just stick gender on everything is my top tip.
Perfect. Okay, great. So collecting data, every single lens, and at all points as you scale. So I think we're at time. So thank you very much all for your insights. I'm going to pass back over to Henry, who's going to speak a little bit about ESGBC and help you find out how to get access to all the resources we spoke about on gender pay gaps and other ESG topics.
Yep, exactly. I'll sprint through this. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining, and thank you so much to all of our speakers. Lots of incredibly useful tips and insights. Check us out on esgbc.co.uk. Download the measurement framework that we've built for broader ESG monitoring in startups. There's also a link through to our resource hub there. We'll make this recording available afterwards, and do please come along to all of our events for the rest of the year. We'll be covering off tons of interesting issues across sustainability, diversity, corporate governance, everything related to ESG. So look forward to seeing you at the next event, and thank you very much for joining today.
Thank you, everyone.
Everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.